The following program is brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org.
The following program is brought to you free of charge by the generous sponsorship of an anonymous donor in honor of Saints Thomas Aquinas and Teresa of Avila. Please keep this donor in your prayers.
Welcome to Restoration Radio. I am one of your co-hosts, Stephen Heiner. You are just listening to Palestrina's Tues Petrus, and we are here today at a major show, 3 hours in length, so get in a comfortable chair or get someplace comfortable because we're going to be here for a while. Now, we're very privileged, my co-host Nicholas Wansbutter and Dr. Pierre Thugel, to be joined today with His Excellency Bishop Donald Sanborn, who's going to help guide us through the documents, at least 6 of them, that comprise the Second Vatican Council. Because of the length of the show and because of the amount of detail we're going to be going into, we won't be taking telephone calls this show, but we do encourage you to leave questions on Twitter. The handle is @TrueRestoration. We'll be monitoring those and we'll be answering those questions every 30 minutes. At least we will do our best to. Today we have a show sponsor, and that's another first for us in addition to it being a 3-hour show. But today's show is sponsored by Novus Ordo Watch. And I'm going to read the ad here. For the past 5 years, Bishop Bernard Fallet, head of the Society of St. Pius X, has engaged in endless doctrinal talks with Benedict XVI's representatives to get official recognition from the Vatican II Church. Yet many in the Society agree with Bishop Bernard Tissier de Malaray, who recently warned that the cost of being recognized is to be silenced from speaking out against a revolution in the Church. This very danger was seen as far back as 2005, when Novus Ordo Watch accurately forecast Benedict XVI will seek to destroy the traditional Catholic resistance not by attacking it, but by neutralizing it. He will seek to undermine its reason for being. Though the talks have stalled, Benedict's aim of neutralizing the society hasn't changed. As the Vatican says, it still seeks to bring the group into its fold. For the web's most incisive analysis of this and other issues vital to Catholics, visit novusordowatch.org. Now entering its 11th year of exposing Satan's war against the Church. Stay informed with novusordowatch.org. And I will share more about sponsorship opportunities later in the show. But first, I'd like to talk a little bit about our guest. I think he's fairly well known among traditionalist circles, but some people tuning into our show today may not be familiar with him. Bishop Donald Sanborn was ordained by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre in Icône. He was one of those Americans who went over to Switzerland to find some semblance of a traditional formation after he had tried basically a seminary that had been imbued with the Novus Ordo takeover. He was almost immediately sent back here to the United States to help run things, be it the school on Long Island that was connected with the society, or the seminary, which first started in Michigan and then moved to Richfield. And there, the then Father Sanborn served as rector until his expulsion from the Society of St. Pius X in 1983. He, along with 8 other American priests, were expelled at that time. The then Father Sanborn continued with his pastoral work, reading, writing, serving in Michigan, which then turned into a seminary in 1995, Most Holy Trinity Seminary. And more recently, that seminary has moved down to Florida, certainly a warmer climate than Michigan's. And somewhere during that time period, also in 2002, Bishop Sanborn was consecrated bishop. So I suppose, Your Excellency, this is your 10th year anniversary, is it not?
Yes, that's correct.
Well, congratulations, ad multos annos.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I think we had been talking in the pre-show discussion that it's unfair to, obviously it's been 40 years since the council, 4 years of a council, so many documents. We're really just narrowing our focus to 6. So we're not going to be able to cover everything, but I think you agree that there are some major points that can be, 1 or 2 or 3 major points that can be taken out of each of these documents to show just how radical the thinking is within these council documents.
Yes, that's correct. An awful lot of what is in Vatican II is a repetition of Catholic doctrine or Catholic philosophy, but there are some very important points sandwiched in all of that are contradictory to Roman Catholicism, and they have to be looked at very carefully.
Absolutely.
Now, my Lord, before we jump into the documents themselves, I was thinking it would be important for our listeners and important for us to give a context to our discussion. If we could get you to talk a little bit about what is an ecumenical council and what makes a gathering of bishops an ecumenical council versus some other sort of gathering or a general council of the church, I guess would be the other proper term to use.
Well, usually ecumenical council and general council mean the same thing. There are certain differences of terminology, but it means a gathering of all the bishops of the church in principle, that is, where you have a legitimate representation, morally speaking, of all of the bishops of the church. It doesn't mean that every single bishop in the whole world must be there, but it must be a general gathering of the bishops of the church, and they come together under the convocation of the Pope, by his convocation, and under his authority. And up to Vatican II, the only reason for the convocation was to combat a heresy, because they are extraordinary things. And these ecumenical councils, the word ecumenical coming from the Greek word for household or general household, oikumene. The word economy comes from the same thing. They have the power, if they are approved by the Pope, to declare and define doctrine solemnly. And that's what they have always done. And we, of course, are familiar with the great councils of Trent and Nicaea and many others which the lay people may not be familiar with, but which have all defined doctrine solemnly. And that is an ecumenical council in contrast to a local council in a country where bishops may come together and make certain laws, usually of a pastoral nature. Seldom will they speak about doctrine at those things. They're usually pastoral. Those actually can be elevated to Catholic teaching if the Pope approves of what they have said. There are a number of cases of that, where the Pope elevates their teaching to the magisterium of the Church. But an ecumenical council is one that I described, and it means the same thing as a general council.
And, Lord, you mentioned the Pope giving his approbation to something that a council's done. And I've just been reading in preparation for the show the book Tumultuous Times by the Fathers Redetschke. And it seems that that's one of the keys that sets a general council apart, or what makes a general council a valid one or a real one is if the Pope or the papal legate, in the case of many of the earlier councils that were held in the East, signs off on it, if it were, and then that's what sets it apart from anti-councils or things that aren't part of the magisterium that may not necessarily be anti-councils. Is that accurate?
However, it is, but it is also true that the Pope can declare as an ecumenical general council one that was not necessarily convoked by him. He can elevate it to that level, and in which perhaps there were not delegates of the Roman See. The whole thing in the Catholic Church, the man with all the power is the Pope, and he can make his own the doctrinal pronouncements that were made by various councils, and he can elevate them to the level of general councils if he wants to.
Your Excellency, you mentioned how it's possible for what you call a pastoral council to be upgraded, so to speak, to an ecumenical council. Now, one of the canons of Vatican II is that it was not a dogmatic, but a pastoral council. This has been used by some traditionalists to suggest the lesser importance of the documents that follow from it, even that we might, to a certain degree, ignore them. Could you explain what you understand by that use of the term pastoral council with regard to Vatican II?
Well, it is true that John the 23rd said that the purpose of the council, one of the purposes, is a pastoral council, and that it was necessary to present the traditional doctrine of the church in a new way. However, that does not exclude doctrine. If you look at any of the general councils, they all spoke about pastoral things. Trent did, Ephesus did, Nicaea did. There are pastoral considerations and enactments in all of those councils. There's hardly any council that I can think of that spoke only about doctrine. So to hang your hat on that is as if to say, well, we really don't have to pay attention to it, or it doesn't have any authority because it had a pastoral end or purpose. It's just not true. And there are many declarations in that council which contradict that idea, that it is merely pastoral, that it is merely a question of making certain laws or certain disciplines. You have in one document it says, this council solemnly declares. Now that's language that is appropriate to a solemn teaching of the church, a ex cathedra teaching of the church. Whenever a council says, we solemnly declare. Now, if the council fathers had understood that we're speaking only about disciplines here, we're not even touching dogma, they would never have said those things. You have also the dogmatic decree on the church, the dogmatic constitution on the church, that was meant to complete Vatican I. That dogmatic constitution was actually prepared for Vatican I, but Vatican I had to disperse in the summer of 1870 because of the Franco-Prussian War and the invasion of the Freemasons into Rome. But so that was meant as a completion, and that was the original idea of the council, even under Pius XII, was that the dogmatic council of Vatican I had to be completed. And that was on the minds of all of those popes. They could not do it for as long as the Roman question was burning, but Pius XII actually started to think about a council in order to complete the dogmatic council of Vatican I. However, the cardinals persuaded him against it because they said that the situation in the church is so volatile dogmatically that the council might go bad. And therefore, he decided not to do it.
Right. Now, my Lord, you made mention of dogmatic constitution, and that's something I'd ask you if we could speak a little bit about that before we go into the documents, because we're going to hear about different types of documents. There's dogmatic constitution, declaration, and decrees. And I think we'll be covering one end of the pastoral constitution as well, I suppose. I think that's how Gaudium at Spes has identified it.
Yes.
What's the difference between a constitution, a declaration, and decree?
At bottom, there's no difference from the point of view of the authority of it. All dogmatic theologians treating of that say the same thing. Encyclicals, this, that, or the other thing, whatever you want to call the document, really doesn't matter. What matters is the intention of the Pope or of the Council in what he is teaching, the authority that he is using in order to teach. So, for example, an encyclical could talk about 100 different things, but it could contain perhaps 2 dogmatic statements that are de fide catholica definita, which are defined Catholic doctrine. Casti connubii is an example of that. The condemnation of artificial birth control in Casti Connubii of Pius XI in the 1930s is a dogmatic, a solemn dogmatic statement concerning that. And however, he said many other things in there that were merely explanations of Catholic doctrine, and he did not intend to promulgate those as defined doctrines. So it really doesn't matter what they call it. What matters is the individual sentences, the sections where you see language that involves authority. Also, the citing of revelation is another sign of declaring with authority. Because if they cite revelation, it means they are interpreting this sacred scripture or tradition in this way, and therefore it is binding upon the faithful.
Well, it seems that there's a lot of scripture quoted, but sorry, go ahead, Stephen.
Oh no, that's fine. I was going to say you're talking about the intent, and that's another. Piers mentioned the canard of pastoral council. Well, it's a pastoral council, so we don't have to worry about it. We didn't think about it. So too, well, that was the spirit of Vatican II. That isn't what Vatican II said. So the I think you referred to it as the interpretation. There's another way of looking at it too, is also the interpretation. Can you speak a little bit to, who interprets the council? What is that? How does that form, or does it form part of the magisterium?
Well, interpretation in general is the discovery of what a person, a writer, or a group of persons in this case, meant when he said something. And it's important to understand that he meant a certain thing, one certain thing when he said something. So even if he said it ambiguously, in his mind he meant a certain thing. Ambiguity can only be in terms and in sentences and in words. It cannot be in the mind. It's very important to understand. So there is a single mind of Vatican II and a single interpretation. Too often, again, for people who are finding problems with Vatican II, they would like to see interpretation as spin. That is, we can take this and work with it and massage it in such a way that it comes out orthodox, that it is not offensive to Catholic doctrine. But that has really nothing to do with what they meant. Now, the Church operates on authority, and the persons, obviously, who are authorized to tell us what the council meant is the authority, or the persons in authority. So we should look at not only the statements of Paul VI, John Paul II, and Benedict XVI, but also their actions and even their permissions, because when authority permits something, and does not condemn something which it ought to condemn, it is considered to consent to it. That's a general moral principle. So you have to look at all of those things in order to say what Vatican II meant. And clearly, if you look at those things, it puts an entirely heterodox interpretation upon Vatican II. There's no way to save it if you are taking their interpretation, the interpretation of authority, in order to interpret that council. The other thing I would say is that no council in history ever had this problem. Councils clarify. They don't make things dark and gray. They clarify. There was never any problem about what Trent meant or what Nicaea meant. After 50 years, we're still talking about what this council meant. And the reason for this is that there are many people who understand that council has a serious, serious problem. It contradicts, and it is responsible for the general condition of the church today, which is absolutely deplorable. And they do everything that they can to find a way out. That is, a way of saving the council, on the one hand, and of somehow making it orthodox, and this is what they call the hermeneutic or interpretation of continuity.
Your Excellency, that's a term I've discussed with friends on the kind of Novus Ordo, or the more conservative wing of the traditional movement, or the conservative Novus Ordo. But I wonder whether, for the purposes of this discussion, we too, as questioners, as it were, should assume the orthodoxy of these documents, try and test them for this hermeneutic continuity, to see how far we can interpret them in a more positive spin. And certainly, I've been trying to do that so that we can really demonstrate that there is an impossibility in doing that.
Yes, I think that's correct in this sense that when you have the entire episcopate of the Catholic Church united with the person who, by all external appearances, is the Roman Pontiff, the presumption is in favor of it. Whenever authority speaks, the presumption is always in favor of the fact that it's doing the right thing or saying the right thing. And presumption is only overcome by fact. And therefore, yes, when you go into Vatican II, as we all did in the 1960s, those of us who were alive in the 1960s, open those books figuring this is another wonderful council of the Church, and we can't wait to hear what this council is going to say.
Very good. I mean, it's difficult knowing where to begin in a way, because there's so many documents, and so many of them are so long, voluminous even. You suggested that we begin with ecumenism, because I understand from you that you feel that the new interpretation of ecumenism, or the focus on ecumenism in the Council, is really at root and the central idea. And with that in mind, we're going to begin with Unitatis Redintegratio, the decree on ecumenism of the 21st of November 64. I should just point out to listeners of Restoration Radio that they can follow along with text as we discuss it on Twitter, if they go to the Restoration Radio Twitter account. So could you perhaps begin by explaining why you think ecumenism is the key, or the place that we should begin discussing the Vatican II Council?
Because first of all, we have to understand the Council as, and this we understand in hindsight. I did not see this in 1964 or 62, but in hindsight, we have to understand the Council as the triumph of the modernists to bring about a transformation of the Catholic religion without, however, changing the Catholic structure. If you read Loisy and various other modernists of the turn of the last century, they have this dream of a church that will conform itself to the modern age and all of the modern thinking, the Enlightenment. And if you go back, if you go back even into the 17th century, there was a general call for the elimination of the dogmatic differences among Christians and an amalgamation into one church. Immanuel Kant said in the late 18th century that the greatest moment for religion is when they all abandon their separatism, so to speak, and join into one big general religion. And he was, of course, one of the quote-unquote bright lights of the Enlightenment. And then in the 19th century, there was a lot of movement among the Protestants, especially with the rise of the liberal Protestants, and also even among the Jews. For example, Adolphe Crémieux founded the Alliance Israélite Universelle, the Universal Jewish Alliance, in the 1840s. And his stated goal was the transformation of Judaism into something that is acceptable to the modern world, and through that to transform other religions so that they too become acceptable to the modern world. And then, of course, the modernist movement came up through the liberal Protestants, spilling over into the Catholic Church, and that was a very, very strong movement among them, was the erasing of the dogmatic differences between various religions. And so you had that famous movement in the 1860s in England, the Society for the Promotion of Christian Unity. I forget what it was called exactly, but which was very, very clearly condemned by Pius IX. and where Cardinal Patrizzi said that these principles that you are putting out here, which are essentially the principles that Vatican II put out, are absolutely and intrinsically contrary to the nature of the Catholic Church. It's a very important document. He was the head of the Holy Office at the time, Cardinal Patrizzi.
Right.
And that whole episode, the branch movement, the branch theory movement in England, was really a precursor of this whole thing. And then it spilled over into the liturgical movement, which, as you know, was hijacked by modernists in the like the teens, the 20s, the 30s. And their idea was the accomplishment of ecumenism through the liturgy. And it was Baudouin, one of their, again, bright lights, quote unquote, or prime movers might be a better word, who said, what we need is a pope who will call a council and consecrate ecumenism. And therefore, I think that at least one of the major contributing causes of this council is this idea to consecrate ecumenism and to make the content of the Catholic Church not the Catholicism that we have always known, but a vanilla, dogmaless, humanitarian religion that is able to get along with any other religion on the face of the earth. So I think it's pivotal.
Yeah, I mean, the actual document itself it sort of intimates heresy in various places. It never quite goes as far as these earlier kind of suggestions, or the openly heretical suggestions about unifying all religion into one kind of global religion. But there are certain points that I thought were worth picking out when I was going through it. The first one I wanted to ask you about was section 3, paragraph 1, in which the authors speak about the Eastern churches as being, quote, separated from full communion with the Catholic Church. Is that a traditional idea, or is that something new, this idea that some through, quote, some through imperfect communion with the Catholic Church, they go on being...
It's a very traditional idea among the Protestants.
Of course.
The Protestants have always spoken about that. Well, you know, I'm in partial communion with you because we agree on certain things, we don't agree on others. And the Protestants, of course, see the church as a production of humanity. They come together because they believe the same things, and not a production of God, not something that God has created, and a structure that God has created, but something that human beings have created. So they have no problem in saying to each other, "Well, you know, I'm halfway into your church, so to speak." But the actual author of that particular term was Oscar Kuhlmann, who was a personal friend of Benedict XVI. He's dead now. Oscar Kuhlmann is dead, but he was the one that cooked that up, that business of partial communion. I defy anyone to find in traditional dogma books the idea of partial communion. It doesn't exist. It is an entirely new thing. It's a novelty, as the church always has horror of novelty. It is contrary to all of the dogma concerning the church and all of the classical ecclesiology concerning the church.
Yeah, I mean, section 3, the same section, paragraph 4, seems to have an even more striking and suspiciously heretical claim, and that is that non-Catholic churches can act as means of salvation. It says, "For the Spirit of Christ has not refrained from using separated churches as a means of salvation which derive their efficacy from the very fullness of the grace and truth entrusted to the Catholic Church." I wondered whether there wasn't actually a way of reading that in a more traditional way, such that the decree is merely saying that whatever grace believers in non-Catholic churches acquire comes from and through the Catholic Church, rather than from the separated church to which they actually belong. Is that a viable reading, do you think?
No, I don't, because it says these ecclesial communities, these churches and ecclesial communities. It's a heretical statement as it stands, because it says that these organizations, these groups, which in the eyes of God do not even exist, because they're not true churches, and what is not true does not exist. So in the eyes of God, they don't even exist. They are simply collections of schismatics or heretics.
Yeah.
That they are means of salvation. Now, that's a very important statement. The only thing that these groups have are the stolen property of the Catholic Church with regard to some valid sacraments at best, or with regard to some doctrines at best. Now, I made an analogy in one of my articles of an airplane that has no jet engines and maybe no wheels, but it has some of the elements of a jet airplane. Now, would you take that from New York to Paris? And someone would say, well, what, are you crazy? Of course I wouldn't get on that airplane because it's missing all of its many essential parts. When you say something is a means, you're saying that it has all of the necessary ability to take you where you are supposed to go. And that is heretical. All these people can do is, yes, teach you some truth mixed in with heresy, give you a valid baptism perhaps, and in the case of the Greek Orthodox, give you a valid Eucharist. But in doing these things, in preaching and in doing the sacraments, they are actually committing sin, and the people who are taking part in them are also committing sin objectively. And Pius the seventh or sixth or seventh said that concerning the constitutional clergy in France. He said that very thing, that it's an occasion of sin for both, to bring your child to the baptismal font of the constitutional clergy. It's a sin to do that, and it's a sin for the priest to give it. These people are committing sin. This is the traditional theology of the Church. It was Cardinal Mazzella in the 19th century who said that these are the stolen goods of the Catholic Church. But so at best, they can give you some of the elements of sanctification. Illegally and improperly and sinfully, they can do that, but nevertheless validly. But that doesn't mean that they are a means of salvation. No. Salvation means that they are the way in which to go to God. That if you observe everything that they tell you to observe, you will end up in heaven. That is a heresy. There is a single means of salvation, and that is the Roman Catholic Church. And Pius IX said it. He said it is a most well-known Catholic dogma, and Vatican II explicitly contradicts Pius IX on that.
Yeah, so it does sound pretty heretical. That's talking about the Eastern churches or the separated ecclesial communities, but there are suggestions in the document too that about the Church itself, the Catholic Church, which seem odd, perhaps to a traditional sensus catholicus. Earlier magisterial teachings, for example, emphasize that the Church is a perfect society. It's divinely instituted and without spot or wrinkle, a term that Leo XIII uses in Satis Cognitum. But we hear the same phrase from the Canticle of Canticles used here, but in apparently a different way. Quote, every Catholic must therefore aim at Christian perfection, and each according to his station play his part, that the Church, which bears in her own body the humility and dying of Jesus, may daily be more purified and renewed against the day when Christ will present her to himself in all her glory without spot or wrinkle. This seems to suggest that the perfection of the Church without spot or wrinkle is something that will only be achieved at the end of time. Again, it is the way in which it can be understood orthodoxly as saying that perfection is only something that will be manifest to men at the end of time, but is always there.
Yes, that is also heretical in this sense that the constant teaching of the Catholic Church concerning itself is that it is infallible, indefectible, and pure and holy in all of its essential aspects and qualities. It says nothing about the conduct of its members. But in everything that God has made it, it's holy and pure and without stain and wrinkle. To say that is only an eschatological thing, that is that in the evolution of time we're going to end up that way, implying that right now we're stained with all of these divisions, which is certainly the spirit of that document, is heretical.
Okay.
Understood in that way, it's heretical, and I think that is the proper understanding of it.
certainly the fact that the Church then suggests that her children might wish to apologize for their sins towards schismatics and heretics for not actually being a good enough model for them, and therefore, in a sense, forcing them away from the Church, would suggest the heretical interpretation that you give.
Yes, and let me say something about that. That is a naturalistic way of looking at it. If a person who is baptized loses the faith, he loses it through his own fault.
Yeah. Because
the faith is a supernatural virtue infused by God. And the only thing that can destroy that supernatural virtue infused by God is the sin of infidelity, either apostasy or heresy, some form of infidelity. So even if you see scandalous clergy or you see things in the church you don't like, that has nothing to do with that divine infused virtue that is in your soul. And the church has always taught that those who lose the faith lose it through their own fault. And so the church has nothing to apologize about concerning those divisions, because it all concerned doctrine. It was not a question of whether, for example, Cardinal Cajetan raised his voice when he talked to Luther. I mean, that's just so perfectly absurd that we won't even think about it. Or that, even worse, say that cardinals are running around with women, and sad to say it was true. But that had has no direct effect upon the faith. Yes, it does scandalize, and it decreases the fervor of the faithful, absolutely. But it does not destroy the faith in anyone. If you lose the faith, it is through your own fault, and that is why you necessarily go to hell if you die impenitent in such a state.
Thank you for that. We only have a couple more minutes left on this topic, but there is one other expression in this decree which I thought was worthy of asking you a question about it, and that relates to this argument over doctrine in the practice of ecumenism that the decree also discusses in the second or third chapter, and that is about the idea of hierarchy of truths. It's one of the shibboleths, I suppose, of this document, and something that people argue about, because it's claimed in the document that this is a traditional idea. It's mentioned in paragraph 3, section 11, for those who are following on Twitter. The exact expression is this, quote, "When comparing doctrines with one another, they should remember that in Catholic doctrine there exists an order of hierarchy of truths, since they vary in their relation to the foundation of the Christian faith." What do you think this is meant by this expression? Why has it been used here? And is it reducible to a consistent and orthodox?
It is a typically Protestant statement. The Protestants in the 19th century had this movement of the fundamental truths. See, Protestants have always had the problem of putting themselves back together. Ever since the 16th century, they've been splitting up, and they've been trying to somehow put themselves back together. And ecumenism was therefore born in Protestantism long before it had anything to do with the Catholic Church, centuries before the Catholic Church. There's been this movement in Protestantism to create what they call the unam sanctam. That's among Protestant theologians. They refer to the unam sanctam. That means the one big holy church, unam sanctam. It's putting it all together so that there could be one big Protestant church. And so one of the attempts to do that was to adhere to the fundamental truths. Well, of course, that flopped, because then they start fighting about what are the fundamental truths. And this reference in this document is definitely related to that there are certain basic truths that we really have to adhere to, and the others we can negotiate away. Leo XIII condemned that in one of his documents. I can't remember which one it is, but that's condemned.
Thank you very much. I think we probably ought to summarize that document and finish off and lead on to Gaudium and Spes, which I think would follow, logically speaking, in terms of our discussion. But I wondered whether there was any final comment you would like to make about the place of Unitatis Redintegratio in the Vatican Council and the work gone on since then.
Well, ever since that document, ever since the council, the main problem in the church has been the extirpation of dogma. dogma no longer exists. There is no maintenance of dogma in religious houses or seminaries or universities. Pluralism is the new dogma. In other words, you could recite the whole creed, you could recite the anti-modernistic oath, you could say, I believe all of these things, but, I'm a pluralist, I see your side too. And then you kill all of the truth of the Catholic faith in that one sentence of pluralism, that it's all true and it doesn't really make any difference, kills off the essence of the Catholic Church. Our Lord said to Pilate, I have come to witness unto the truth. And so the church comes to witness unto the truth. If you relativize truth, you kill it. Truth by its very nature dispels falsehood, dispels any kind of contradiction. And supernatural truth, revealed truth, does that all the more and does it to the 10th power. It dispels falsehood. And if you take that away from the Catholic Church by infusing ecumenism into it, you destroy the Catholic Church. That's my comment on that document.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency.
Well, I think we're at the bottom, a little bit past the bottom of the hour, so it's a good point to remind those who are just tuning in that you are listening to Restoration Radio's jumbo-sized broadcast on Vatican II. Today, I'm Stephen Heiner, and I'm with Nicholas Wansbutter, Dr. Piers Hugel, and our esteemed guest, Bishop Donald Sanborn. Your Excellency, we have a couple of questions from Twitter that I want to address before we move on to the next document. One we have, and I suppose these can be sort of short answers. Your Excellency, which of the Vatican II documents has the most blatant example of deviation from the Catholic faith?
Ecumenism.
So the one we just did?
Yes.
The second question was, Monsignor Fenton revealed John Courtney Murray and Jacques Maritain as condemned by the Holy Office in 1958, but this was never made public. Can you speak to this at all?
I'm not familiar with that. It sounds, I'd love to become familiar with that, but it's the first I've heard that. John Courtney Murray was the author of the document on religious liberty, and Maritain was the author of Integral Humanism, which is the spirit of Gaudium et Spes, and we'll talk about that shortly. But so, I mean, if I could find the document of the Holy Office that condemned those two, I would be very happy. And if that person could provide it, I'd love to see it.
Okay, well, the challenge is out there to the questioner to bring forth some documentation. And if we get it here on Twitter, we'll share it with you, Your Excellency, and with the rest of our listeners. So our next document, and we here in the spirit of Vatican II encourage active participation in the show. So if you'd like to follow along with the documents, I'll be posting them on Twitter. I'm just now posting the next document, which is Gaudium et Spes, which Nicholas Wansbutter will be guiding us through with you, Your Excellency.
Okay.
Right, and Gaudium et Spes, I think, my Lord, you'd agree, is another very important document in the Vatican II, the whole Vatican II Council, and it seems to me that it's the one that really lays out the true spirit of the Council, if we want to use that terminology. And I'm mindful of the fact that when Cardinal Ratzinger, writing in the book Principles of Catholic Theology, referred to Gaudium et Spes. His quote is directly, if one is looking for a global diagnosis of the text, referring to Gaudium et Spes, one could say that it, along with the text on religious liberty and world religions, is a revision of the syllabus of Pius IX, a kind of counter-syllabus. So we have right from there one of the people with the authority over Vatican II saying that it's counter to the syllabus of errors. And I think that probably gives us a starting point of what this document's about. But what I'd first comment on is I found this document really difficult to read. It's over 70 pages. And my impression is that it scarcely says anything of substance over the 70 pages. It seems to do a lot of talking without actually saying anything.
Yes, I'm surprised they didn't talk about dog catching in it. They mention every single aspect of human activity and have something to say about it, and except dog catching, I think was left out. This is a pivotal document in Vatican II. The first thing I would say about it is that over and over again in that document, if you take the time to read it, they are hammering the point that there is a new age of man, that man has changed, and in a very exaggerated way, that it is as if he's a new creature or a new species or something. All of these social communications and socialization and psychology and throwing in a tremendous mix all of these new trends, as if it has totally transformed man. That is one of the big themes of that, and that's very important for the modernists, because the modernists say that it was necessary to change the medieval church so that it could speak to modern man, that modern man cannot listen to a medieval church, a church that is steeped in scholasticism, as they say, or all of the thinking of the Tridentine era, and it's just too old and nobody's listening. And so this is their major premise, so to speak, in the argument, is that man is essentially new. And since the French Revolution, since the Enlightenment, everything's new. They didn't mention those things specifically, but you can see that everything they mention as new really proceeds from that era. And then the minor premise in their logic is, well, we have to speak to this modern man, and we have to be somehow related to this modernized man. And so that's the second point of this document, is that the church is in the service of the world. And by that I mean not that, it has to be charitable to the poor and all, which is of course true, but it has to link up with this modernized world, with the internationalist scheme to perfect the world by means of what they call socialization. I would call socialism, internationalist socialism, this general scheme to perfect the world by means of purely natural virtues. In some cases, not virtues, what are perceived as virtues. And therefore, it is an abandonment, as I see, of the church's true mission to sanctify souls. Hardly ever, I don't think the word soul is in there. There is no idea of bringing human beings to the eternal salvation, of snatching them from the pits of error and sin and bringing them to the knowledge of the truth in the Roman Catholic Church, and by that and through the sacraments and other means of sanctification, of bringing them to eternal salvation. Rather, you see a Teilhardian idea of bringing the world into some perfect state, which is the eschatological, that means the end of the world state of man, which in their view is going to be just the perfect thing. The perfection of man without grace. This is the project of the modern world. And it enlists the church in that whole project and makes it the gospel, and it tells Catholics they have to go out and involve themselves in this modern world and bring about this new transformation of the whole world according to socialist principles and various other modern principles. It's an apostasy if you think it out and what it's saying. And the third thing that is very obvious in that is this constant reference to the dignity of man. The dignity of man in this document becomes the highest good of man. It becomes the basis of all morality. And so if something is not in accordance with the dignity of man, it's a sin. There is no reference to not being in accordance with the commandments of God. The church is the upholder of the dignity of man, and therefore the upholder of morality, which contributes to the dignity of man. Now, that's interesting because Benedict XVI said, for example, that in his underhanded permission for the use of condoms, said that the use of condoms is against the dignity of man. It's against the dignity of the person and the dignity of the marital act and so forth. And John Paul II constantly talked about the dignity of man. It really is a very central theme to Vatican II and to all of the post-Vatican II magisterium. And I would say those three things: the idea that we are in a new age of man, and therefore we have to speak to this new man, and the church is at the service of the internationalist, socialist, dreamy world builders. And that the church is the upholder of the dignity of man, as if it were the supreme moral principle, are the three major points of that document, and they are devastating points.
Now, the idea of the dignity of man, is that something completely new, or is there some precedent for that in Catholic theology?
No, certainly man has a dignity in as much as he is created in the image and likeness of God, and it says that. And he has a dignity in as much as he is redeemed by the blood of Christ, and if he is in the state of sanctifying grace, he retains that dignity. Obviously, mortal sin gives no dignity to man, and his dignity is totally lost in mortal sin. And you see, that's a supernatural view of the dignity of man. If you read that document, though, they're not talking about those things. They're talking about the dignity of man according to his nature, that according to the demands and the decency of nature, what is in accordance with his nature. The whole document is naturalistic, and it is not something that is imbued with a supernatural spirit and any kind of supernatural treatment of the dignity of man. And the dignity of man, furthermore, has never been the norm of morality. The commandments of God are the norm of morality, not the dignity of man. It's very accidental.
And one of the difficulties, I think, with Gaudium et Spes is it's hard to find an exact line that I can point out to you, as Dr. Hugel did with the previous document, where we can look at it and say, is this heretical or not? Because they don't seem to have any clear statements in the document, and it's more of one that you need to take the document as a whole. Is that
the document as a whole? Those are the things that come off the page. For example, it enlists Catholics in the forming a new one world order. It says, this is number 82, this goal undoubtedly requires the establishment of some universal public authority acknowledged as such by all and endowed with effective power to safeguard on the behalf of all security, regard for justice, and respect for rights. Now that is a one world government with a police power and a military power to enforce itself. So there are many texts in it that you could refer to that definitely exemplify what I have stated about it. It contains also, certain references to like respecting the beliefs of others, which of course is this is number 73. In addition, men are learning more every day to respect the opinions and religious beliefs of others. Now, we cannot respect heresy. We might be charitable to a person who is in heresy, but we cannot respect heresy, because heresy is a mortal sin. It's one of the gravest mortal sins in the whole book. We cannot respect, in that sense, the religious beliefs of others if they are in heresy or apostasy or some, they're not even baptized. There's nothing to respect there because they are in error. So it would probably be beyond our ability in this interview to go through the various statements, but there are many supporting statements to what I have said concerning it.
Right. Well, here's one statement that I'd put out, because we were talking about the dignity of the human person, and this seems to be, they have a whole chapter just on the dignity of the human person, aside from it being noted elsewhere, and it's chapter 1. So again, that's further solidifying the point that this is the key to this document. And the first sentence under chapter 1, the dignity of the human person, it's number 12 on the version that I'm looking at on the Vatican website. So it says, according to the almost unanimous opinion of believers and unbelievers alike, all things on earth should be related to man as their center and crown.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is very typical. The man center, the man as the center of all creation, and that was very typical of the Renaissance. It's all the new thinking that the Church took a very strong stance against, and it has sort of broken down the doors of the Church and has come in as a flood with this document. In number 55, it says, "This truth grows clearer if we consider how the world is becoming unified and how we have the duty to build a better world based upon truth and justice. Nothing about the Catholic faith. Thus we are witnesses of the birth of a new humanism, one in which man is defined first of all by his responsibility toward his brothers and toward history." And now, man, where is God in that? That right. Sounds like the manual for becoming a Freemason. I mean,
and beyond that, is it not? It strikes me as an absurd naivete about the circumstances of the modern world, even back in the 1960s. I'd say things have gotten a lot worse since the 60s, but would you agree with that assessment, that it's just incredibly naive to say that this is what's developing in the world at that time?
Naive in what sense? In other words, it was naive for them not to see these developments as hostile to the Catholic religion.
Right.
The Catholic Church has always considered these elements as hostile. And modernism, the condemnation of modernism by Pius X was sort of the final word on this. The condemnation in the syllabus of the various modern movements and Quanta Cura and Mirari Vos and all. You can see in all of the encyclicals of Leo XIII and the encyclicals of Pius XI and Pius XII, they are constantly setting up a greater bulwark against these ideas and are condemning these ideas and are protecting the Catholic faithful from these things. For example, in this country before the council, you had a Catholic association of everything, a Catholic association of lawyers, of doctors, of journalists, of this and that, everything, perhaps dog catchers too. The Catholic Church in this country wanted to isolate Catholics from the bad influences of the modern world. And so you had the CYO, the Catholic Youth Organization. I remember in my school in the 1960s, as late as in my high school in the 1960s, we were not permitted to play basketball games with public schools. We could only play the Catholic League because we were not supposed to have contact with the bad influence of the modern world. And that was always the stance of Catholicism. And in so doing, Catholicism flourished. When Pius XII died in 1958, the Catholic Church was in excellent condition because precisely it had protected its faithful from these evil influences. And here we are about 60 years after Pius XII died, and it is an absolute shambles. Mm-hmm. And it is all from this new spirit of opening windows and doors and various other things to all of this stuff which is contrary to Catholic teaching. These modernists think that modern man is going to listen to the Catholic Church if you put modern lipstick on her, if you fix her up and make her look modern, that they're all going to turn their heads and look at her. I mean, I'm sorry to put it that way, but that's what Vatican II tried to do. That we, the traditional faith and traditional church, we can be modern just like you, and we're with you. We're side by side with you in forming this internationalist New World Order and the dignity of man and all of this other stuff. And therefore, you're going to accept us, and we're going to be talking to modern man. This is the mind of all of those people. Cardinal Ratzinger, or Father Ratzinger at the time, he said that modern man cannot relate to going into a church and finding God in a tabernacle. That's in one of his works. Ridiculing the idea of the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament and making a visit to the Blessed Sacrament. But do you see where he's coming from? Is that we cannot say that to modern man. We can't say this to these people imbued with the Enlightenment and the French Revolution and socialism. We can't say, they won't listen to us if we say that. We say that God is present in the tabernacle. And that's the mentality of these modernists, and you have to understand that in order to understand Vatican II.
Yes, and I think actually we've run out of time, so I'm going to have to sum up here, but I just want to make the point quickly that that's something where you can find direct quotes that directly contradicts a prior practice or teaching of the churches. Gaudium and Spes explicitly at a number of points condemns this idea. I think implicitly condemns the idea that you were just speaking about, my Lord, about keeping oneself separated from the corruption of the world. And just as one example, under number 21, speaking about atheism, they say that while rejecting atheism, Root and Branch the Church sincerely professes that all men, believers, unbelievers alike, ought to work together, etc., etc., and it says that this cannot be realized, however, apart from sincere and prudent dialogue. This is that dialogue we have to discuss. Error has to discuss truth with the church in order for us to somehow reach the betterment of society. And then in that same paragraph goes on to condemn state authorities making a distinction between believers and unbelievers. And I think we'll be able to get into that again when we... yes,
there's more to say about this, so later. When you come back, let me know.
Right. So I think we can come back to that point a bit with Dignitatis Humanae, but just to sum up, we've been speaking for the last 20 minutes about Gaudium et Spes, pastoral constitution of the church, and I think we've established that it's a difficult to pin down document in that it's very lengthy, very wordy, without saying a lot of substance, but within that, you can find clearly giving the direction of this openness to the world and trying to put a modern face on the church to that this is somehow going to assist in evangelical efforts, and that this document, perhaps more than others, is responsible for the fruits that we see in the utter disaster that is the situation in the church and the world today.
Yes, and by the way, if we have time, do you need to break or something, or can I say something in about
You can
2
finish
minutes?
your point, Your Excellency.
Yes, this is Maritain. Maritain, this is integral humanism. Maritain's idea of integral humanism was that humanism needs a Christian face, and we need to join forces with the new humanism with Christianity and sort of complement humanism with Christianity. And Paul VI was a devout disciple of Maritain. They were personal friends. And it is of no wonder that Paul VI, was very much involved in this document, and he was. By the way, this document, if you look at its pedigree, it has all of the worst modernists as the contributors. I don't know who actually wrote it, but in researching the document, the names are the cardinal modernists of the time, and Paul VI was very, very much interested in this document. And it's Maritain. It is fix up the church to look modern, and the modern world will love you.
Oh, I think the point is very well taken, Your Excellency. I think a lot of people don't know enough about Maritain. I think there's that Orthodox period he had, and then people don't know he just sort of wandered off into the favor of Paul VI, and much to everyone else's de-edification, I might say.
This program was brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org.